Hello, and welcome to this episode of Health Matters, a health program brought to you by the Farmington Valley Health District. My name is Jennifer Curtanis, Health Director for the Farmington Valley Health District, and your host for this episode. Today's episode focuses on something we all take for granted, drinking water. How many of us even think twice before we turn on the faucet, brush our teeth, take a shower, or fill up a drinking glass? In Connecticut, more than 800,000 residents use private wells for drinking, bathing, and cooking water. In the Farmington Valley, we have a high proportion of homes that depend on private drinking waters or private wells, particularly in our more rural towns. While public water is routinely monitored and checked, there are things homeowners should know about their private wells to ensure its safety. Today, we are very pleased to have with us Tiziana Shea, who is a sanitary engineer with the Connecticut Department of Public Health Drinking Water Section, to talk to us everything we need to know about private wells and making sure that we're maintaining those in a safe and an appropriate manner. So welcome and thank you very much for being here today. So I mentioned the fact that our public water supplies are routinely monitored and checked by the public water companies and overseen by the Connecticut Department of Public Health. With private wells, whose responsibility is it to really ensure their safety and that they're maintained?
Absolutely. So when we're talking about private wells, it is a responsibility of the private well owner to make sure that they're maintaining their private well water systems themselves. So it's just like any other major component in their home, so it's their responsibility.
So just like if they have a septic system, a washing machine, a refrigerator, it's really something that they have to keep track of. So for most of us, we really take our water and its safety for granted. You know, as I mentioned, you know, we turn on the faucet and we don't really think twice about whether the quality of the water coming out of that faucet is okay. But, you know, what are some signs that might suggest there is a problem or something has changed with our water?
Absolutely. So there are things that we should pay attention to. So things like, well, first of all, any change, any noticeable change to you. But taste, odor, color, those are things that we want to pay attention to. We also want to pay attention to any potential plumbing issue. So if we notice pinhole leaks or something like that, that may also be an indicator that maybe you have a corrosive water quality. But more importantly, actually, sorry, there are many contaminants that are actually silent in water. So I just want to make sure that I touch on that as well. So a lot of contaminants, you may not actually have any indicator. You know, they're colorless, they're odorless, they're tasteless, and so the only way to know if they're there is to test for them.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we just want to emphasize is even if you've had a private well that's been providing you with water for a long time and you haven't noticed a change in water pressure or anything, things can change over time, correct?
Absolutely.
I mean, and can you talk just a little bit about what over time might cause water quality to change?
Absolutely. So there are things that may be influenced by season. It could be the groundwater could be influenced by the actual soil and bedrock that it's tapped into, so those are things that would be naturally occurring. Things could happen in the area where there may be a spill or some kind of contamination issue that could result in a change in our water quality. So there's lots of things that we need to pay attention to. So it's not okay to just test the one time, unfortunately. We need to test periodically to make sure that things are still safe.
Yeah. So we often, the one point in time that, you know, we get a lot of questions about well testing is during real estate transactions. So typically during a real estate transaction, there is water testing, so that can kind of serve as a benchmark. What types of things do they test for during real estate transactions typically?
Yeah, so for real estate transactions in Connecticut, there are actually no laws requiring testing. However, a lot of times a mortgage lender is requiring testing. So many times a mortgage lender will require specific tests that they feel are important. But sometimes folks will give us a call and say, what do you recommend? And we actually have a publication that provides some information about the things that we would recommend testing for. Our recommended testing list is pretty comprehensive. There's a lot of things on it. We do recommend that people look at all of those, though, holistically to make sure things are okay. Especially when you're buying a new home, you want to know what the water quality is before you enter the home so that you can correct any issues if there are any.
And then I guess I jumped right over to real estate transactions, but when a new well is drilled, what types of, are there requirements at that point in time to determine what we call the potability or the drinkability of a
Yes.
water supply?
Yeah, so when a new well is drilled, there are requirements before you can actually use the well. So testing required would be things like bacteria, nitrate, nitrite, sodium chloride, trying to think of pH, color, odor, some of those general chemistry things, iron and manganese generally.
Yeah.
I may be missing one or two, but that's a general gist of it. So it's really looking at some of the acute issues like nitrate and bacteria, along with some of the general chemistry of the water.
Yeah.
Additionally, the local health departments in Connecticut do have the ability to require additional tests too. So if a local health department is aware of an issue in an area, they could ask for additional tests, and those things are all written into our laws as well, so they have that ability.
Yeah, so at least we know that those are 2 points in time where private well testing might take place. We'll get into a little bit more detail about recommendations for ongoing water testing, but before we go there, are there things that a homeowner can do just to ensure that the area around the well is protected and is not in any way contributing to contamination of water within the well?
Absolutely. So there are a lot of general things that we could do when we're thinking about our private well water systems. We want to think about the groundwater overall and think about the things that we're actually doing near and around our well. So things that we want to consider are limiting or not overusing things like fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. So those things are not necessarily bad to use. It's just we want to make sure that we're using them in accordance with whatever the manufacturer specifications are. So using them carefully and just not overusing them. So that's one thing. Other things that we could consider doing is making sure that stormwater is not pooling around our well casing, so that things are flowing away from our well and not towards it. Looking at chemicals in the area, so anything that might be considered hazardous materials, making sure that those things are stored far enough away from the well, and if they're not, or even if they are, making sure that they're actually in secondary containment can also be a really important thing too, just because we don't want them to spill or contaminate groundwater in general. So looking at the chemicals and hazardous materials, another thing that would be important too is making sure that the well is accessible. That's kind of a general thing, just so that if you do need to get into the well and work on it, you have access to it. But overall, just think about the land use overall around your well and the things that you're doing around it, paying close attention to that.
Yeah, so people often ask, is it okay to plant, gardens or things like that around, their well casing? Any general recommendations or cautions there?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're going to be putting something around the well casing, a couple things that we want to consider is not impeding the area around the well casing overall. So we don't generally we tell people, try not to actually cover it up with things. We don't want things growing in and around the well. That could be a problem. We also want to prevent things from coming towards our wells, like rodents and things like that. So we don't want to really encapsulate it. Sometimes people want to decorate it and put things over them. But if we're looking at gardens and things like that, think about the things that you're going to be applying in those gardens, the use of fertilizers or pesticides, things like that, before you make a decision on where those things go.
Okay. All right. So the other thing is the well cap. So our water from a private well comes primarily, you correct me if I'm wrong, from two places. The groundwater, so that's water deep beneath the surface that might travel through bedrock, et cetera, and get to the well. And also potentially surface water, right, that then drains down. So what is the importance of the well casing, or the well head, or the top of the well cap?
Yeah, so when you're looking at the well head itself, you want to make sure that it is it's not vulnerable to contamination. So that really is an important key to our wells. Even though it's the only portion of our well that's visible and may only be 6 to 12 inches above grade, it's really important to take a look at it. And the reason is we want to make sure that we're preventing anything from getting inside of that well. That's the portion of the well that's actually potentially exposed, right? So we don't want surface wash to get in, we don't want rodents to get in, debris, things of that nature. So when we're talking about the wellhead itself, it should be at least 6 inches above grade. It should have a good watertight well cap, which you were just talking about. That well cap should actually look like, it should actually have a rubber gasket around it, have bolts. The bolts should be secured and sealed properly. And now if I'm describing something that doesn't sound familiar to you, then that would mean that you may need to consider replacing that well cap with something that does have a rubber gasket and bolts so that it does seal against the well casing tightly to make sure that there's a good seal there.
Yeah, so that brings up another question. You know, if a homeowner really doesn't, know what they're looking at when they go out and, they have a general sense, this is my well, but I have no idea if this well cap makes sense or is appropriate or safe or could be better. Who might they call to help assess that?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, so for private well owners, we do actually have a document provided on our website, at DPH's website, and that is, you can find that actually at testyourwell.ct.gov, our landing page. And it's actually a checklist. It's a best management checklist that homeowners can take a look at. And when they do that, they can actually identify some of the things that they can look for when they find their well. If they're not comfortable doing so, though, they can always contact one of our licensed professionals in state. We have a lot of good contractors in state that can help them, or they can always call our department and we can help them, guide them in the right direction. Excellent.
So we touched on water testing a little bit ago, and now I want to just really kind of shift gears. Once, a homeowner goes out and kind of assesses and feels that, the well casing is above grade, they're not storing chemicals, they're doing all the right things to protect it physically. What are some of the recommendations for existing homeowners around periodic well testing? Or water testing?
Absolutely. So I think this is probably going to be the most important component for most people when we have private wells. If nothing else, this is the most important thing. Everybody should test their wells on a regular basis. We do actually recommend testing annually for some of our basic parameters, some of the things that I mentioned earlier, like the bacteria, things that are acute, nitrate and nitrite. Other things that might be included in that basic parameter list would be things like iron, manganese, color, odor, turbidity, pH, things that are just going to kind of tell us about the general chemistry of the water. But in addition to that, we also would recommend testing every so often for things that might be naturally occurring, things like uranium, radon, arsenic, fluoride, things that just may naturally be in the groundwater. And most of those things that I just mentioned don't have any indicators again. So testing is the only way to know that they're there. In general, we recommend testing somewhere between 3 and 5 years for those things. But at the very least, at least one time while you're in the home. Additionally, we would recommend testing for stuff like lead, maybe copper as well, especially if you're in an older home. Right. Those things may leach from our plumbing systems. And then there could be man-made contaminants, things like volatile organic compounds, which could come from petroleum products or things that may have gotten into the groundwater.
Yeah. So who would a homeowner turn to if they wanted to do their annual water testing?
So if they're looking to do testing, then they could actually contract with one of our private laboratories in state. We have several in state that actually are certified to do testing, and they can do testing for any drinking water system, so including private wells. Yeah. So we'd recommend contacting them. I generally tell people, call a few of the labs and determine who you feel most comfortable with in choosing a lab. You also want to have a good idea of what you want to test for before you call them, so that you can find the lab that can do all the tests that you want to.
Yeah. And I know you brought there are brochures because, as you mentioned, the list of things that you might consider testing for can be long.
Yes.
And there's a nice kind of checklist in here that speaks to what you should test for and how often, et cetera.
Right.
And then when people do test for these things, like for basic potability, there are guidelines or recommendations or ranges that are deemed acceptable, correct?
Right.
And so can the private lab help them interpret that? Will they give the results in that context, or is that something they may need the state or local health department to help them interpret?
Yeah, so oftentimes the laboratories, when they provide these results, will give the homeowner a report, and so they'll indicate in some way that there may be a level that may be slightly elevated or problematic. Yeah. When homeowners get those results, so they'll have that way to kind of notice it, they can always give us a call at the state. We can help them interpret, or they can call you at the local health department, and we're all available to help interpret those results. And even more than that, just identify what steps they can take for corrective action. So we're always happy to do that.
Yeah. So I know depending on the contaminant or the issue at hand, there are different types of treatment approaches. Can you just describe in general kind of the variety of water treatment systems and or approaches that a homeowner might need to consider if different contaminants are elevated?
Absolutely. So when we're talking about different contaminants, the number one thing, again, is going back to the testing. You want to have the test results in front of you so that you can make informed decisions about what you're going to do for treatment. And once you have that, you can actually decide what you need to do. The treatment devices always need to be tailored to the issue at hand. So some contaminants can actually be treated by installing something under your kitchen sink to treat just the water that you're drinking and cooking with, because some are only concerned with the water that we're actually consuming. In other cases, it might be a broader issue. With the water that is coming into the home, that may also be problematic for skin absorption or inhalation. So in those cases, we want to make sure that we're treating all of the water in the home. In terms of treatment devices, there are so many different devices. There is no one treatment device, unfortunately, that can treat for all the different contaminants that could be in water. So if you have multiple issues, you could end up having multiple treatment devices installed. I'm actually going to add right here, before I forget, that it's really important that if you do install treatment, that you maintain it properly. So servicing that treatment device to make sure that it's working properly is really important. If you're not maintaining it properly, you actually could end up having more problems in the long run than you started with. So you want to make sure that you're maintaining that device properly. But always make sure that you're tailoring the treatment to the problem at hand.
And so I know certainly at the Farmington Valley Health District, we have sanitarians that are well versed in some of the different treatment options that are available depending on the contaminant at hand. And certainly, we defer to our subject matter experts at the state as well if we have a really challenging one. Sometimes what we find during well installation that doesn't become an ongoing problem is bacteria. How can you describe how we treat private wells when elevated levels of bacteria are identified?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Bacteria is actually one of the outliers a little bit. So in dealing with bacteria, we need to look at it in a different view. So when we're thinking about bacteria, we want to identify what the pathway was. Bacteria shouldn't really be in groundwater. So if it's found there, we need to identify whether or not there's a pathway for the bacteria have gotten there. So a couple of things that we need to consider. Is this an existing well? Does the well have a good watertight well cap?
Yes.
Is it in a well pit below grade? A lot of our older homes in Connecticut actually have wells and well pits, so we want to consider that too. In those cases, we want to take a look at any vulnerabilities with the wellhead itself. If we can identify those problems, we want to make sure that we correct them. Once that issue is corrected, then we want to disinfect our water systems, including the plumbing inside the home and starting at the well, and then do that properly. Wait for the chlorine to dissipate. Test again. See if that has corrected the problem. If it hasn't, there are options that homeowners can take. If you can't find the right solution for it, ultraviolet disinfection would be one way to actually take a look at that. Also important to note too is if someone recently did plumbing in their home, sometimes bacteria can actually get introduced in that way as well. So disinfection of the water system, the plumbing, when we have bacteria in the well and in the water system and the plumbing is important.
Yeah, I know we do get inquiries about that, and the vast majority of the time the treatment with chlorine is really effective, and we have been able to identify that there was some external source that needed to get addressed. So, but thank you for addressing that. So I wanted to just switch gears a little bit to talk about water conservation, because I think we take often the water that flows into our homes for granted. It's interesting. We've had droughts in the past, and perhaps people in the Northeast don't really consider us a, a drought at risky location compared to, say, the West. But we do experience droughts. And what should we all be doing to preserve what is a finite natural resource that we really are dependent on for life?
Absolutely. So like you said, this is a resource that we want to make sure that we're protecting. And so there are definitely measures that we can all take. It's really important, especially like you mentioned, for us during times of drought, but also some private well owners actually experience a low water quantity or low pressure on a regular basis just because they may be in an area with low yield.
Okay.
So in those cases, these are measures that they might want to do on a regular basis, along with the rest of us. So there's some general simple steps that we can all take. Things like making sure that we turn off the water when we're brushing our teeth. Things that we learned about in school.
Getting my kids to take shorter showers, which is like impossible.
Right. I know, especially during the winter in Connecticut. So those are simple things that we can do to actually, just cut down on water usage on a regular basis. Again, shutting off the water while washing dishes, shutting off the water when we're brushing our teeth, taking shorter showers. But in addition to that, we can actually look at other things too. So we may want to invest in certain things like low flow fixtures or appliances, energy efficient appliances that we can install. We also want to take a look at our water usage outside, because that's a really big one. Making sure that we cut down on maybe lawn irrigation or eliminating it if we can. Reducing the amount of time that we're spending on washing our vehicles outside, and also, maybe reducing the amount of time that we're actually just playing with water outside as kids, which is a tough thing to do. But those are some simple things that we can actually do that make pretty big differences.
Yeah. Well, the low flow utilities like toilet flushing. Right. That's something that doesn't really require any change in human behavior, and over time really can save and conserve a lot of water. So that's something, if people are having to replace a fixture, should really contemplate. And then, of course, you don't realize how much water actually flows out of the faucet as you're standing there for, however less than a minute to brush your teeth. So those types of things are very beneficial. So, well, thank you. We've covered a lot of ground, and it always goes so quickly. We could talk on and on about the specifics of different treatment systems and that sort of thing, but I really want to thank you for joining us today. If you have a private well, really take the time to locate it. The Farmington Valley Health District does have documents available online at their website, www.fvhd.org document search. So if you have a private well but don't know exactly where it's located, you may be able to find that through our document search. Take advantage of the resources that Tiziana mentioned, either at the Connecticut Department of Public Health website or at the Farmington Valley Health Department website, to really help you follow that checklist, maintain your wells, and test periodically for things that might not be any indication that there is a problem, just something that you need to test for routinely. So again, thank you for joining us and providing such good information. And until next time, remember, your health is your greatest wealth.